The microphone trembled in Jack's hand as hundreds of eyes stared at him, the entire school hall frozen in stunned silence, the stage lights burning into his face while his 3-year-old son clung tightly to his neck, sobbing uncontrollably, and Tu Tian stood beside him, her eyes red, her body shaking, not from fear, but from everything that had already shattered before this moment even began. "I'm late," Jack's voice broke, raw and uneven, echoing through the hall. "But I'm here now." No one moved. No one even breathed. Because just minutes ago this wasn't supposed to happen. Just minutes ago. He wasn't even supposed to be here. Earlier that day, Jack had knelt in front of his son, gently fixing the tiny bow tie on the boy's shirt, his expression softer than anyone in the business world had ever seen. "Today is your big day," Jack smiled, tapping his son's nose. "Daddy promised, right? I'll be there. I won't miss it." The little boy giggled, wrapping his tiny arms around Jack's neck. "Promise," the child whispered. "I promise," Jack said firmly. And he meant it. For Jack, promises weren't just words, especially not to his son. Because no matter how powerful he was outside, no matter how many companies carried his name, nothing mattered more than the small family he had built with Tu Tian. The only place where he could finally be human. But someone else didn't see it that way. Just as Jack was about to leave for the school, his phone rang. It was his mother. "Jack, you need to come to the company immediately." Her voice was urgent, sharp. "There's a major issue. If you don't handle this now, we could lose everything." Jack frowned. "Right now? I have something important." "This is your responsibility." She cut him off. "Do you want the company to collapse? Is that what you want?" Jack hesitated. Between being a father and being the heir. Between love and duty. "I'll be there," he finally said. And that was the moment everything began to fall apart. At the school, the music had already started. Children stood on stage in colorful outfits, laughter echoing, parents filling every seat, cameras ready, smiles everywhere. Everywhere. Except where Tu Tian stood. She held their son's hand tightly, trying to keep him calm, but the boy kept looking toward the entrance, his eyes searching, waiting. "Where's Daddy?" he asked softly.
Tử Tiên forced us my...
"He's coming," she said, even though her heart was already sinking. Minutes passed. Then more. Then too many. When it was finally time for their son's performance, the teacher gently guided him toward the stage. "Your turn, sweetie." But the boy didn't move. He shook his head, tears forming instantly. "I want Daddy." The teacher looked helplessly at Tu Tian, and in that moment something inside her cracked. She knelt down, holding her son. "He promised," the boy cried. "Daddy promised." Tu Tian couldn't answer, because she didn't know anymore. She didn't know if promises still meant anything. Meanwhile, at the company, Jack stormed into the building, his expression cold, his steps fast. "Where is the issue?" he demanded. His mother stood calmly near the window, sipping tea. "There is no issue," she said. Jack froze. "What?" "I just needed you here," she continued, turning slowly to face him. A heavy silence filled the room. Then Jack's eyes darkened. "You lied to me." His mother didn't deny it. Instead, she walked closer. "You needed to see clearly," she said. "You're being distracted." "Distracted?" Jack's voice dropped dangerously low. "By that woman," she replied. "And that child." Something snapped. "That is my family." "No," she said firmly. "That is not your son." The words hit like a bullet. Jack's fists clenched instantly. "You don't believe it even now?" he asked, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "I refuse to believe that a child appeared out of nowhere and suddenly becomes the heir of everything you built," she replied coldly. "You're being manipulated." Jack laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only anger. "You made me break my promise for this?" His mother didn't flinch. "I'm trying to protect you." Jack stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "You didn't protect me," he said quietly. "You destroyed something you'll never understand." And in that moment he realized something terrifying. While he was standing here, his son was waiting. Without another word, Jack pulled out his phone and dialed. "Hello, Principal." His voice was calm but deadly serious. "This is Jack." The principal immediately straightened his tone. "Mr. Jack, yes. I need you to pause the event." "Excuse me. I'm one of the investors of that school," Jack continued. "And I'm asking you, not as a businessman but as a father." Silence. Then, "Yes, sir." Jack ended the call, turned around, and ran. Back at the school, just as the music was about to continue, everything stopped. The speakers went silent. Parents looked confused. Teachers exchanged glances. And then the doors burst open. Jack stood there breathless, soaked in sweat, eyes searching desperately through the crowd, until he found them.
Tử Tiên.
And his son, crying, waiting, breaking. And without hesitation, he walked straight toward the stage. Because nothing was more important than this moment. The moment Jack stepped onto the stage, the entire hall fell into a silence so deep it felt almost unreal, as if time itself had paused to watch what he would do next. And for a brief second he stood there without speaking, his chest rising and falling heavily, eyes locked on Tử Tiên and the small trembling figure of his son, who was still crying, still holding on to the last fragile thread of a promise that had almost been broken. Then the boy saw him. "Daddy!" The cry cut through the silence like lightning. The little boy broke free from the teacher's hand and ran across the stage with unsteady steps, tears streaming down his face, arms reaching forward without hesitation, without doubt, without fear. Jack didn't wait. He dropped the microphone, ran forward, and caught him. The impact almost knocked him off balance, but he held on tightly, lifting his son into his arms, pressing the child close against his chest as if trying to make up for every second he had been late, every second he had been absent. "I'm here. I'm here," Jack whispered, his voice shaking, burying his face into his son's hair. "Daddy's here." The boy clung to him, sobbing uncontrollably. You said you'd come." I know. Jack closed his eyes tightly. "And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." That word sorry echoed heavier than anything else. Because for a man like Jack, who controlled companies' decisions and entire futures, this was the one place where he had failed. And he knew it. Slowly he looked up. Tử Tiên was still standing a few steps away, frozen, her eyes filled with tears she had tried so hard to hold back. Her heart caught somewhere between relief and pain, between love and disappointment. Jack walked toward her. Every step felt heavier than the last, because this wasn't just about being late. This was about trust, and he had almost lost it. When he reached her, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he adjusted his hold on their son with one arm, and with the other, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't hold him back either. That silence said everything. Jack turned slightly, picking up the microphone from the floor. The sound echoed again. All eyes were on him. Teachers, parents, children. No one expected what came next. Jack took a deep breath.
"I'm sorry."
The words came out steady, but filled with emotion. "I know this isn't how a father should show up. I know I was late. And I know that for a child, a promise is not something small." He looked down at his son, who was still clinging to him. "It's everything." The hall remained silent. No one interrupted. No one moved. Jack continued. "I was called away by something I thought was important." His voice hardened slightly. "But today I learned something." He lifted his gaze, scanning the room slowly. "There is nothing more important than being here for the people who trust you." A few parents lowered their heads. Some exchanged glances, because they understood too well. Jack turned toward Tu Tian again. And to the woman who has stood by me through everything. His voice softened, almost breaking. I'm sorry for making you stand here alone. For making you explain something that should have never needed explaining.
Tử Tiên sờ lip chamber.
She still didn't speak. But her eyes were no longer as cold. Jack swallowed, then spoke again, this time more firmly. I won't let that happen again. The weight of that promise filled the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. He looked down at his son. Can Daddy watch your performance now? The boy sniffed, still holding on to him. You won't leave again? Jack shook his head immediately. Never. The child hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay. That small word, so simple, felt like forgiveness. Jack gently set him down. The teacher quickly stepped forward, guiding the boy back into position, but this time, the child kept looking back. Not with fear, but to make sure. Jack stayed, right there, exactly where he said he would be. Tu Tian slowly walked to stand beside him. Not touching, but not distant anymore. The music started again, and this time, the little boy performed. Awkwardly, imperfectly, but with a smile that hadn't been there before. 'Cause now, his father was watching. As the applause filled the hall, louder than before, warmer than before, Jack felt something inside him finally begin to settle. But only for a moment. 'Cause he knew, this wasn't the end. Later that night, after everything had quieted down, after their son had fallen asleep in Tu Tian's arms, Jack stood alone by the window at home, his reflection staring back at him, tired but clearer than before. Behind him, Tu Tian's voice broke the silence. Your mother did that on purpose, didn't she? Jack didn't turn immediately. Yes. A pause. Then, because she still thinks our son isn't yours? Jack closed his eyes for a second. Yes. Silence filled the room again. But this silence was different. Not broken. Not fragile. But heavy. Real. Tu Tian walked closer, standing beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, What are you going to do? Jack finally turned. His expression had changed. There was no hesitation now. No confusión. Only decision. I'm going to protect my family. Simple. Clear. Final. Tu Tian looked at him carefully, as if trying to see whether those words would hold this time. Then, slowly, she leaned her head against his shoulder. Not fully forgiving. Not completely healed. But choosing to stay. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the window, a storm was still forming. Because far away, in the quiet office where everything had started, Jack's mother stood alone, staring at a document on her desk. A DNA test. Unopened. Her fingers tightened around it. Her expression unreadable. Because the truth had not yet been revealed. And when it was, everything could change again.